Well, good morning again, everybody. Thank you for being here for part two of our webinar. As I mentioned earlier, we are attorneys from Sanctuary for Family providing this webinar in English, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. We are all from the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families, which is New York's leading service provider and advocates for survivors of domestic violence, sex trafficking, and other forms of gender-based violence. In other words, violence that targets someone because of their gender. We provide comprehensive services ranging from shelter, counseling for adults and children, legal advice and representation in orders of protection, victim witness cooperation, family law, custody, divorce, and immigration law, and economic empowerment programs designed to help survivors move into living wage jobs. As a nonprofit, all of our services are free, and we partner with other nonprofit service providers across New York to make sure our clients have access to a diverse array of services. Over the past 5 years, Sanctuary for Families has served over 2,000 survivors of trafficking. So today we wanted to share some information about navigating some aspects of the criminal justice system and how advocates can assist survivors of trafficking to navigate complex processes. And just as a reminder, in part one, we covered what is human trafficking, what are some of the schemes and patterns that we see in particular in New York, what are some of the legal remedies, and we talked in depth about immigration legal remedies. And we did touch upon some criminal justice advocacy remedies, but today's webinar is going to take a deeper dive into these areas of relief. Next slide, please. Great. So I'll pause here to provide a trigger warning. Some of the topics or examples we will be discussing could be triggering. Feel free at any time to take a break, leave the webinar, come back. I encourage all of you to engage in self-care during and or after this webinar. Next slide, please. So what is criminal justice advocacy? This is a broad term that encompasses many forms of legal advocacy when our survivors have contact with the criminal justice system, ranging from being a victim of crime to being arrested themselves. When survivors have contact with the criminal justice system, the experience can be scary, overwhelming, confusing, triggering, and the survivor may have difficulty achieving their objectives. As attorneys, our goal is to safeguard our clients' interests and help them navigate potentially confusing systems, whether our client's objective is to have criminal charges dismissed or vacated, or help to prosecute their abuser or exploiter. Some specific examples of criminal justice advocacy are reporting the crimes that they've been a victim of, collaborating with law enforcement in an investigation against their trafficker, testifying at a trial, or providing a victim impact statement at sentencing stage after their trafficker or their associates have been found guilty by a jury or have pled guilty. Obtaining criminal restitution or compensation, financial compensation, because of the harm they have suffered as a victim. Survivors of human trafficking may have convictions for crimes they committed in connection with their trafficking experience, and these convictions can be vacated through a specific motion procedure at state level courts. Next slide, please. One more slide, please. So before we take a deeper dive into all of these kinds of criminal justice advocacy that I just mentioned, let's start with some basics of who are the players. One of the questions I get most when working with clients is really about understanding who the people are that are involved in their criminal justice advocacy case. So I have some pictures up on the screen to help us here with this. And the first one is on the left. And as you could see, this is a court document. It's a general one. It's a template, so no one's name is on it. But in the top left corner, you'll see it says people of the state of New York versus, and then the defendant. So why is that? Well, police and prosecutors and law enforcement represent, quote, the people of the state of New York, or in a federal case, the people in the United States. They represent society as a whole. They do not represent the victim, even though sometimes the victim's interests and the government's interests are aligned. And oftentimes, police and prosecutors work with each other. Um, the next picture is what appears to be an FBI agent. So when we're working with clients to report crimes committed against them, we usually start with a law enforcement agency. And there are different kinds of law enforcement agents, right? So there are state level police like NYPD. There are also federal police like the FBI or agents from Homeland Security Investigations. And these are some of the agencies that we work with most frequently. So a police officer or a special agent's job is to investigate crimes, identify suspects, and arrest people. Next in the picture is this picture of a typical courtroom setting, and you'll see two desks. The judge is at the front right next to the flag. There's a court stenographer making a transcript of everything that happens. And in most courtrooms, there are these two tables. One side is the prosecutor representing the government of either New York State or the United States. And at the other table is usually defense counsel, right? And who sits with the defendant. So prosecutors are lawyers who work for the state or federal government. They continue and pick up the investigation where the police leave off and are responsible for seeing the case through. So bringing charges against a particular defendant in court. Oftentimes, the defendant is the abuser, perpetrator, or trafficker of our clients. The defense attorney is the person representing the defendant or the person that has criminal charges against him. That person can, in some cases, be our clients at Sanctuary. In some cases, that person is the trafficker themselves. There's also a jury. Sometimes you'll talk about people either taking pleas or going to a jury trial, right? So a defendant has the option of taking a plea, meaning accepting culpability for something and taking a plea without a trial, usually in exchange for a lesser crime. Sometimes defendants opt for a jury trial, and you can see these people on the side. It's supposed to be a jury of your peers who decide whether the person is guilty or innocent of the crime they're being charged with. At the front of the judge, he provides or she provides instructions to juries prior to deliberations and sits on the bench. Sometimes it's a bench trial and the judge decides the facts of the case and makes a ruling. Judges are also responsible for sentencing a convicted criminal defendant. So where is the victim rights attorney in all of this? So what we do at Sanctuary for Families. So as attorneys working with cooperating victim witnesses, we represent the interests of the victim exclusively. So we accompany survivors who are collaborating with law enforcement during an investigation or providing testimony during the pendency of a trial. When a victim rights attorney is involved, we serve as an intermediary between the client and law enforcement. And if the case goes to trial, we are there to support the client so that she knows that she has someone in her corner that represents her interests. Because as we just learned, often, all times, the prosecutor is representing the interests of the government. Next, actually, before we go to the next slide, I'll just show you this last graphic that I have at the bottom, and you could see the judge is in the middle holding their gavel, and to the judge's right is somebody testifying in a trial. That is the witness sitting next to the judge providing testimony, and to that person's right is an attorney, could be the prosecutor, could be defense attorney, either doing a direct examination or a cross-examination. So that's just one more graphic to sort of land us in where we are with this. Next slide, please. So witness cooperation, we started to go into this in our first presentation. We're going to go a little bit more in depth. But basically, this is when a survivor of a crime in the United States wishes to meet with a law enforcement body, such as a police officer, an FBI agent, or a prosecutor, about the crimes that were committed against them. And cooperation may include one or more meetings throughout an investigation or continue on into a prosecution of the perpetrator. And sort of the steps of when we meet with a client go like this, right? First, when we meet a client, we have a conversation about what their goals are. What are your motivations for wanting to potentially report the crimes committed against them? And this is so key as an attorney in creating collaboration and rapport with our clients so that we as their attorneys can represent their best interests. And clients may have several reasons or just one reason for wanting to report. And those reasons can include seeking protection from the government of the United States, seeking justice, or in other words, I've had clients say to me, I'm really scared to do this, but I don't want him to do to someone else what he did to me. Or the client was apprehended by law enforcement and wishes to cooperate. Or she's looking to comport with a requirement of an immigration benefit. So we talked about in our first presentation, U visas and T visas. And one of the components is cooperation with law enforcement. Maybe the client is interested in seeking criminal restitution, which in federal cases is mandatory. Or perhaps it's just to have her day in court and be heard. Second, we determine what law enforcement agency we're going to report to. So earlier I mentioned that there is a host of law enforcement agent bodies, such as NYPD, Homeland Security Investigations, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, prosecutors' offices. How do we make that decision about who we're reporting to? And this is why it's crucial that the first thing we do is understand our clients' goals and motivations to help us make that very complex decision. And then lastly, in the phases is we liaise with law enforcement and accompany clients to cooperation meetings. And representing clients in those meetings ensures that the client's rights are being protected, that their goals and interests are asserted, and that they can feel supported in what is a very overwhelming and potentially triggering environment. It also helps the law enforcement agent that's participating by having a skilled and trauma-informed professional in the room that could support the victim. And in this slide, I have a picture of a very sort of benign looking room. And I included here because I like to sort of give a visual for our clients who are thinking about reporting. What does it look like on the day that you go to meet with, let's say, HSI, right? And this is not an HSI room. This is just a picture I found on the internet, but this is kind of what it looks like. There's a table, there's a bunch of seats, there's usually no windows, which is usually better not to have windows so that the survivor doesn't feel like there's anyone looking in from a window. And then the survivor gets to choose their seat. Usually there's a translator if it's a non-English speaker sitting on one side, and then the attorney sitting on the other. And then there'll be several people in the room from whatever agent, usually someone asking the questions and somebody else taking notes. And I like to give clients a really detailed overview of what it's going to look like. And this I kind of learned out of an experience with a client. We went to report at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I thought I had done a good job of preparing her for what she would expect, even just visually in the room. And when we left, she said, I was so relieved that no one had on uniforms and guns. And I thought to myself, wow, I can't believe that I missed sharing that. Everyone was in suits or in their plain clothes as officers. And so that was a real learning moment for me to explain to clients, no, agents and officers will not be in, big uniforms with guns. So part of that is providing this kind of a visual of what the room may or may look like. And we have a case example here, and I'll share this just so we could get a sense of what a typical case would look like. So this is a case not based on any particular client, but it's sort of an amalgamation. We'll just go one back. Yeah, thank you. An amalgamation of several different clients of a typical pattern that we would see. And we can call this pretend survivor Jennifer. Jennifer is 28 years old. She was smuggled into the US by a man she believed to be her boyfriend. Upon arrival in the US, she was forced into prostitution. After several months, Homeland Security investigations raided a brothel. Jennifer provided information about her traffickers to the agents. They said they'd be in touch and gave her a phone number for a service provider. We, Sanctuary for Families, meet Jennifer in our office about a month later. She says her lawyer from Homeland Security said he was going to call her again next month. Now what? So a couple of things going on here. In this case, the client has been sort of thrown into this cooperation dynamic with law enforcement rather than affirmatively electing on her own, right? There was a raid of a brothel. She was talking to agents, perhaps relieved to be telling somebody what was happening to her. So as I mentioned before, our first goal in meeting with this client are, what are her goals, right? Is she interested? Is she undocumented? Is she interested in pursuing teen non-immigrant status? And therefore it's perhaps in her best interest to cooperate, right? What can we do as her attorney? We can inform her about the process of applying for that T visa. What does that cooperation look like? Are there exceptions to that rule? For example, is she a minor, right? In this case, no, Jennifer is 28 years old. Is there a trauma exception available to her? Does she want to cooperate? Maybe she wants to seek justice against the people that have harmed her. And so going down the phases of how we assist a client who's cooperating, we begin to build rapport, understand her history, and provide holistic services. So we're meeting her at a time that she's just come out of her trafficking situation. Does she need food, clothing, access to public benefits, shelter, etc.? And let's say Jennifer is interested in cooperating with this investigation, then it's our job to be able to advance her interests. And we accompany her to all future meetings with law enforcement. We liaise back and forth with law enforcement. In this case, Jennifer is undocumented. So maybe as the attorney, we advocate for continued presence with the law enforcement agency, which is a type of temporary status that allows survivors of human trafficking who are cooperating in federal cases to get a status of 1 or 2 years that comes with work authorization, HHS certification, and access to a full range of public benefits. And so for a survivor who may not know about that particular remedy, that's when the attorney can step in and advocate on their behalf. And perhaps this prosecution moves forward into court and later into sentencing. We are there to be able to assist the victim with trial preparation, a victim impact statement where she gets to address her trafficker in court, and then draft an affidavit of loss if she is wanting to seek criminal restitution or money based on what she lost during the time that she was trafficked. And I'll note one more thing about this example, and this is something I hear a lot with clients. When we meet with Jennifer, she says her lawyer from Homeland Security said he was going to call her again, right? So oftentimes when we're meeting clients who have already been in contact with a law enforcement agency because there's been a raid, they build rapport with that person very quickly because oftentimes those agents have been able to extract the person from their trafficking situation. But as I mentioned before, it's really important to note for clients that law enforcement agents or prosecutors for the government have to represent the government of either the United States or New York State. They are not a victim's lawyer. And while they may be advocating for the victim or be pursuing a case against their trafficker, they cannot represent the victim. And that's where attorneys from Sanctuary for Families or other service providers can come in. Okay, next slide, please. So post-conviction vacatur relief, switching gears a little bit. So we're going from cooperation against traffickers to what happens when our clients are forced to commit crimes and then are convicted of those crimes. So this is a form of post-conviction relief, meaning there's already been a judgment of conviction entered against that person. And I've represented clients who have vacatur relief available to them for convictions that were back from the 90s, right? So there's no time limit on these. So vacatur is a remedy in New York State and some other states that allow a survivor to clear their criminal record of crimes that they committed as a result of their trafficking victimization. And so in 2010, New York State was the first of all the states in the United States to enact a vacatur law for trafficking survivors to be able to vacate prostitution and loitering convictions if they could show they were a trafficking victim, they were arrested for prostitution or loitering, that they weren't a perpetrator themselves, and that that motion was brought with due diligence or quickly after they were connected to services. And so we were able to serve a lot of clients under this law to help them to remove convictions from their rap sheet. And it was a really powerful tool for clients who are experiencing barriers in finding housing or employment or access to immigration remedies. And as time went on, even though New York was really the vanguard in this field at first, we really came to see that the law was insufficient because, as we knew from working with survivors, many survivors were not just arrested for prostitution, but for other crimes as well, carrying a knife, having to carry drugs, being engaged in assault or other violent crimes at times. Or what about labor trafficking victims, right? So over the years, Sanctuary for Families and other organizations and advocates in the anti-trafficking field legislated for an expansion of this particular law. And finally, it was recently passed, and Governor Hochul signed it into law very recently. And this is an expanded version of this vacatur relief called the START Act. And what's really fantastic about it is now any conviction is eligible to be vacated as long as you can demonstrate to the court that the participation in the offense was a result of having been a victim of trafficking under state or federal law. And this is huge, right? Because in some cases we were able to, of course, vacate prostitution convictions, but how is that person still going to apply for a job if when they get fingerprinted, a drug possession conviction pops up on their record? So this has become now an increasingly powerful tool. And there were some other aspects of the law that were helpful to survivors as well. One was confidentiality of all documents. So we used to file these motions under seal under a civil rights law. And now it's written into the statute that all documents in connection with these motions are to be held confidential. Another significant advancement in this law is that it's written into the statute that the vacatur is on the merits. So for immigration purposes and for our clients who are also seeking immigration remedies in the US, this is so key. When immigration court looks at a vacated conviction, they get to decide whether this was really a procedural defect or rehabilitative in nature. And if they decide that it was more rehabilitative, then it still counts as a conviction for the purpose of immigration. However, we embedded language into the statute that says that it's vacated on the merits, meaning it was actually procedurally defective, so that the person who receives an order of vacatur is returned to the state that they were in prior to the arrest. So for immigration purposes, this is huge. And I have a case example here for vacatur as well. Again, this is not an actual survivor's story. This is an amalgamation of several patterns that we see, and we'll call this person Alex. Alex is 47 years old. She was born in the Bronx and a star student who loved school, especially math. When she was 13 years old, her stepfather started abusing her while her mother was at work. Alex told her mother, but her mother didn't believe her. She slapped her, cut her hair, and told Alex not to tell anyone, and that no one would believe her anyway. Alex ran away and was quickly picked up by a pimp after falling asleep on the train. Over the next 25 years, Alex was sold from one pimp to another and forced to work on tracks and out of a hotel room. She was arrested for prostitution, drug possession, and assault on more than 35 occasions. No one ever asked her if she needed help. After being brutally beaten by a buyer, Alex was taken to the hospital. The hospital social worker connected with Alex. A detective responded too, but Alex refused to provide any information. Alex again spoke with the social worker and fled to a shelter when she was released from the hospital. Alex meets with a lawyer for the first time. Now what? Right? So back to what I was saying about the first time we meet with a client who's interested in criminal justice advocacy. Is this legal case, potentially a vacatur of these 35 convictions, really one of Alex's primary goals right now? She's just been released from the hospital, has just left a trafficking situation that has endured over 2 decades of her life. She's had 35 convictions already. Is her legal case her primary goal right now? And maybe it is, but maybe it's a few steps after she receives access to basic necessities. She's living in a shelter. Does she have access to food? Does she need continued medical care? Does she need other housing options or access to public assistance? And so what's really wonderful at Sanctuary for Families is we don't have to hone in immediately on the legal case unless the client wants to. And we really defer to the clients as them being the experts in their own lives, knowing exactly what's right for them at any given time. So if Alex says to us, I can't really deal with a legal case right now, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to eat tomorrow, then we have the services available at Sanctuary to help support the client, to get her to a place where she feels like she's ready to embark on this very difficult journey of a legal case, right? And maybe Alex doesn't want to pursue criminal vacatur, right? What are her prior experiences with law enforcement? Were they positive or negative? Most likely, 10 times out of 10, she's had a negative interaction with law enforcement. This could be triggering. Even the thought of going to or asked to trust in a detective or a DA after 35 times of being arrested and no one asking her if she needed help. This is someone for whom systems have failed her from the time she was a child, being abused at home and no one picking up on that. Failure of the people that are supposed to protect her the most, like her mother, to protect her from being abused, right? On top of 25 years of being trafficked and the trauma that goes along with that. What is she hoping to gain potentially with a vacatur motion? Well, at the beginning of the story, we heard that Alex was an amazing student who loved school and had an interest in math. Maybe Alex has been harboring dreams of becoming an accountant one day. These convictions would present a serious barrier for her in wanting to seek education and later employment. And lastly, is she ready? Does she want to go to counseling first? Is she ready to sit down with the DA and talk about her trafficking experience? So these are all part of the calculation that we help a survivor to think about in making goals for themselves. On a procedural note, under the START Act, this is exactly the kind of case that we were contemplating when trying to expand the law. So under the prior version of the vacatur law, only Alex's prostitution convictions would have been eligible. But now with the expanded law, all of her convictions, including drug possession and assault, are eligible to be vacated. With 35 arrests, we also perceived that they were probably in multiple jurisdictions. Maybe she had arrests in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens. Under the START Act, she'd be eligible to consolidate those motions and perhaps only talk to one DA in one jurisdiction instead of multiple meetings. Next slide, please. So the last form of criminal justice advocacy that we're going to talk about today is collaboration. So we've talked about post-conviction relief, what we can do after a judgment of conviction is entered. But what happens when a client is arrested and they're still in the phase of either being indicted or it's their first appearance in front of the court? Well, one thing a victim advocate can do is collaborate with the defense bar. So we are not defense attorneys, we're not appointed counsel in these cases, but we collaborate with our colleagues at Legal Aid or Bronx Defenders or Brooklyn Defenders. And we can do a lot as advocates in this space too when a client has been arrested. We can provide context, the circumstances. Were there compelling circumstances around this person's arrest? Was our client arrested for shoplifting? Was she just trying to get diapers for her baby? right? Was somebody forcing her to shoplift that item? If it's someone that we've already worked with and we have perhaps state level confirmation or federal certification, these are documents that we can provide to defense counsel to bolster their case and demonstrate compelling circumstances. For our immigrant clients, we can also advocate for immigration neutral dispositions. So if someone is applying for, let's say, a T visa, the last thing we want to do is jeopardize that case with a disposition that could harm the person's chances of obtaining immigration relief. So this is just another graphic of perhaps defense counsel arguing in front of the judge who's up at the front on behalf of our client. Next slide, please. So in our last presentation, we talked about what are the ways that you can reach out if you believe that you are a victim of these crimes or someone you know or love are a victim of trafficking. There are two ways you can reach out that we're presenting here. One is through the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. This is a national level hotline where you can leave a message, receive a call back. And of course, at Sanctuary for Families Anti-Trafficking Hotline, if you call this number, you'll be connected to a voicemail and an outgoing message in English, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. On our team at the Anti-Trafficking, we speak English, Spanish, French, Arabic, Hebrew, Chinese, and Japanese. So it's likely you would get a call back in your preferred language. Next slide, please. And with that, we're going to return to the main room for question and answers with all the panelists together. Thank you, everybody.
All right, I think we're good to go. Thank you again, everyone. We're going to start with the Q&A. Please use the Q&A box. It's in the bottom of your Zoom kind of tools, and says Q&A, it's to the right of the shared screen.
And so everyone knows all questions will be translated into Spanish and Mandarin Chinese, as well as the answers.
As I was exiting my room, I got a question, so I'm gonna say it in English, and then I'll translate. Do you want me to give my response in Spanish and you want to continue in English, Jessie, and then Kathy? Okay.
That sounds great.
Okay. So, la pregunta que recibí es sobre los intervinientes en el proceso penal. Entonces voy a hacer una pequeña recapitulación ahí. Tenemos a la policía, que son los que empiezan la investigación. Luego la investigación la va a continuar tal, que es el encargado de llevar el caso ante un tribunal. Una vez que ya que el caso va a tribunal, hay un acusado, que va a ser la persona que se piensa que cometió el delito, que en los casos de trata va a ser el tratante, pero en cualquier otro delito puede ser el que cometió el robo o el que cometió la violación. Ese es el acusado. Y el acusado tiene un abogado defensor. Ahora también yo les había estado hablando del abogado de la víctima. El abogado de la víctima participa en la etapa previa al juicio, es decir, durante la etapa investigativa, apoyando a la víctima en sus reuniones con la policía y la fiscalía cuando se están recabando antecedentes sobre lo que ocurrió. Y luego, durante el juicio, el abogado de la víctima no participa. Esto es diferente de lo que ocurre en Latinoamérica y por eso se crean algunas confusiones, porque en Latinoamérica el abogado de la víctima participa en la audiencia misma. Puede hacer preguntas, puede hacer objeciones, pero aquí en Estados Unidos eso no existe. El abogado de la víctima apoya en la etapa previa y luego cuando hay una condena, el abogado de la víctima va a apoyar a la víctima si quiere entregar lo que se llama un Victim Impact Statement, que es la oportunidad que tiene la víctima de decirle al juez directamente cómo el delito la afectó y que quiere que eso se tome en consideración a la hora de que el juez determine cuál va a ser la sentencia contra el condenado. Entonces ahí me avisan
Muy
por el
amable,
chat
sí, me
si,
quedó clara.
si se entendió o si hay alguna clarificación.
Sí, gracias. Me quedó clara la respuesta. Tengo una segunda pregunta.
Ok, si puedes
Adelante.
ponerla en el chat, Ángela, mientras
Sí,
Jessica contesta en
no
inglés
problem.
y Katy en mandarín.
So I'm not going to remember all of that, but the question posed was sort of to ask for a review of who the players are in the criminal justice center. And so Barbara gave a brief overview of the players, and I could do that again. So in a typical courtroom setting or in a criminal hearing, there will be the prosecutor. If you remember the visual that we had up on the screen of those two desks in front of the judge, the prosecutor, whether it's a state or federal prosecutor, is representing the interests of the people of the state or the United States on behalf of the government, right? This is the person or the body that's bringing a case against the accused person, the person being charged with a crime. So for example, maybe it's a trafficker being charged with sex trafficking, alien smuggling, criminal conspiracy. That person, the accused person, has a constitutional right to counsel. That person is a defense attorney, either appointed by the court or privately paid for. And the case is against the accused person. A victim witness in the United States doesn't have the same constitutional right to counsel. In Latin America, from what I've learned from Barbara, the victim witness has their own attorney to defend their rights and who actually has a direct role in the actual investigation and prosecution on behalf of the victim. In the United States, the victim has advocates that may participate, like at Sanctuary for Families. We're not part of the actual criminal procedure. We're not allowed to produce evidence, but we are there to represent the interests of the victim in liaising with law enforcement and to help them, for example, draft a victim impact statement, create a draft of affidavit of loss or the criminal restitution or the amount of money they're trying to get back for what happened to them. So there are, various differences in the different systems of law. And I think I captured that all. Did I miss anything?
OK，刚才问题问的就是想再了解一下我们刚才说的，就是谁是刑事司法系统里的主要的相关法，所以这个系统里边主要的相关法，第一就是警察和检察官或者是执法部门，这些人物代表的是所谓的人民，比如说纽约州的人民或者是美国公民，就是为了美国社会来就是起诉就是比如说人贩子或者是其他犯罪的人。那么被起诉的那一个人在宪法里边是有权利可以有自己的律师。这个律师会帮他，就是维护一下他自己的权益，会帮他就是他的辩护律师。那么我们的客户如果当做受害者证人的话，其实在宪法上没有相关的有律师的权益。这个跟有一些拉丁美洲的国家不大一样。好像有一些其他的国家是可以允许受害者证人把他们自己的律师带到法庭那儿去上庭，但是在美国是不可以的。那我们这边如果我们的律师是帮我们的客户去当这种受害者证人的话，我们是可以就是帮他跟美国的执法部门合作，或者是给那个检察官搜集一些资料。我们自己不能去上庭，不能就是直接给法官提供任何证据，但是我们可以就是在准备的过程中帮助受害者，还有帮助执法部门就是准备一下案子。 Nini, if you have anything to add to my translation.
Just one term that might help a little bit with them to understand. 就是在警察和这个他们代表人民的这一方在咱们国内这个叫做公诉方，就这个公诉方和被告方在法庭上是对立的关系。这个公诉方就是代表的是人民，然后他们会起诉对这个社会造成任何伤害的人，都是由公检方来起诉的。
Other questions?
¿Alguien más tiene preguntas? También las pueden hacer verbalmente, se pueden sacar el mute.
Ángela, ¿usted tenía otra pregunta?
Yes, thank you. Okay, I had a second question regarding to Bacatur.
Ajá.
A una víctima que ha sido sometida durante su cautiverio, lo que fuera a delinquir para la investigación, como lo mencionó nuestra compañera, se le puede borrar todo ese récord criminal, pero la víctima debe mostrar pruebas de demostrar que fue sometida por un abuso, fue coercionada, fue obligada. Ella requiere mostrar pruebas. Muchas veces nuestras clientas no guardan, no tienen. ¿Cómo uno puede ayudar a una clienta en un momento dado? Preguntarle esa historia y darle esa información. La experiencia que nos contó nuestra expositora fue muy interesante, porque el dar la información a las clientas motiva a que se abran a una oportunidad diferente. Entonces la pregunta concreta es, ¿se requiere que ellas tengan pruebas para demostrar que fueron sometidas y obligadas a delinquir? Esa es my question. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer first in English, Barbara, or do you want to take it first in Spanish?
Voy a partir en español y de ahí te lo envío.
Okay.
Buena pregunta, Ángela. No se requiere corroboración y evidencia física en estos casos de Bacatur. Lo que se requiere sí es una declaración de la víctima en sus propias palabras contando su experiencia de trata. Por eso es que es importante que el abogado de la víctima y la sobreviviente tengan una conversación extensa y honesta sobre lo que fue su experiencia, y el abogado va a recabar toda esta experiencia por escrito en una declaración que en mi experiencia tienen entre 7 y 10 páginas, en que se cuenta todo el abuso y la situación de trata que la persona haya sufrido. Y esto es suficiente como evidencia. Además, el abogado presenta una parte de esta moción que se presenta, el abogado testifica que en base a su experiencia y al análisis de credibilidad que hizo de la víctima, considera que el relato es certero. Entonces no es necesario que una víctima tenga reportes de policía de hace 10 años, no, esto es en base al testimonio que la víctima le da a su propio abogado. A veces puede que el juez, luego una vez que se presenta esto, el abogado irá con la víctima a la fiscalía, y ahí puede que el fiscal tenga preguntas acerca de este relato escrito, pero a veces puede que con el relato escrito sea suficiente, pero van a ser solo preguntas como en tono de conversación y no una presentación de evidencia de tipo juicio. No sé si me faltó algo, Jessie.
Just that if there is government issued, and I'll translate all of this into English after, but my additional thought would be, if there is a government issued confirmation of the individual's victimization, such as an OTDA, HHS, T visa, that will be considered before the court prima facie evidence of that person's victimization.
Jessie agregó un muy buen punto, que es que nosotros a los sobrevivientes de la trata muchas veces les conseguimos algún tipo de certificación de parte del Estado o del gobierno federal que las identifica como víctimas de la trata. Entonces, si yo tengo un certificado del Estado de Nueva York que dice que a Juanita se lo reconoce como víctima de la trata, eso va a servir como evidencia en que al solo tenerla a la vista ya se va a considerar que la persona es una sobreviviente de la trata.
So the question posed is, many survivors do not have physical evidence of their victimization. Are survivors who only have their story eligible to vacate their convictions? And the answer is yes. You do not need any corroborating evidence. The evidence is the person's declaration or sworn affidavit that they were a victim of trafficking under state or federal law. And that declaration is often very detailed and has to go through the elements to make out the crime committed against them. Many clients do have some form of corroborative evidence, like a notebook that they were forced to write down the numbers of drivers, or receipts of MoneyGrams sent back to the home country, or that the person was already arrested and prosecuted for sex trafficking, or or other types of evidence, but many clients do not. And so it's not necessary. The one thing that is very helpful that's embedded in the statute is that if there's a government issued document that confirms their victimization, this is prima facie evidence, and you need very little else to prove that that person was a survivor of trafficking.
刚才问的问题很好，就是问一下，如果受害者没有直接的证据的话，能不能还是把以前的定罪就是用那个撤销诉讼的方式来就是从他们的犯罪记录抹下来？所以答案就是是可以的，其实不需要什么其他的证据，最重要的证据就是受害者的自己的故事。当做他们的律师，我们会帮受害者写一个很详细的宣誓书。这个宣誓书会包括他就是所有的贩卖的经验的一些细节。我们必须是把这些细节都加进去，这样就可以证明一下这个人确实是人口贩卖的受害者，并且他们以前犯过的罪是跟人口贩卖有关系。有的时候会有一些客户有一些就是小的证据，比如说他们在那时候可能存在一个就是一个本子里边写一些笔记或者是可能以前给其他的国家打钱或者是甚至有一些人贩子可能已经进监狱了，已经被告了，这些都可以当做一些其他的支持宣誓书的证据。但是我们也有很多的客户任何证据都没有，只有宣誓书，这个也可以。然后最后也想说一下，就是这个法律里边其实里边说的是，如果有政府的什么文件可以证明一下这个人是人口贩卖的受害者，这是一个很重要的证据，可以就是帮助撤销诉讼所以这个政府下来的证明其实是比较容易可以拿到的。我们如果当你的律师的话，是可以帮你去申请。
Jessie, we have another question in the chat. To start the reporting process, what information is important to have about the trafficker?
So there's no threshold that you need to meet in order to report a crime committed against you. Some clients know quite a bit about their trafficker, their complete legal name, their date of birth, where they live, where they're from, their family members, what ring they're a part of, their Facebook handle. Some clients do not have much information. Some clients maybe only know the apodo or the nickname of the client or have very little information. There is no minimum threshold to report a crime committed against you. In working with your attorney, though, the attorney will help the client to be able to think of things that could be helpful for a crime to be investigated. Maybe she doesn't know the name of the trafficker, but perhaps she remembers the address of a brothel, or perhaps she remembers the name of the taxi driver that picked her up from the airport and brought her back to the family style hotel. So the part of the attorney in this aspect is really important for helping to think of really creative ways to give information that would justify opening up an investigation. And oftentimes for our clients, the traffickers may already be on law enforcement's radar. So they may say, well, we already know this person with that particular nickname, and maybe able to flesh out more questions for the client.
Nos estaban preguntando cuál es la información importante acerca del tratante que hay que entregar cuando se hace una denuncia. Lo cierto es que cuando uno quiere reportar que la comisión de un delito, no hay un mínimo de información. Hay que reportar, lo primero es que ocurrió un cierto hecho que es delito, y va a variar caso por caso. Algunos clientes tienen mucha información acerca de la persona de quién fue su tratante, pueden tener su nombre completo, su dirección, su teléfono, pero otras veces pueden solo saber el apodo o solo saber el barrio donde algo ocurrió. Pero eso no quiere decir que no vaya a ser suficiente, solo que estas son las cosas que en conversación con su abogado van a poder ir encontrando maneras creativas de ir ordenando la información que se tiene y de conseguir otras cosas. Como por ejemplo, si una clienta me dice, me acuerdo que fue un hotel en Brooklyn, arriba de un deli que era de tal forma, entonces nos ponemos a buscar en Google Maps, a ver si reconoce una calle acá, una parada del metro, y ahí podemos ir buscando la dirección exacta. O por ejemplo, la clienta solo sabe el apodo de su tratante, pero cuando hablamos con la policía, el tratante ya estaba en el radar de la policía y lo conocen por su apodo. Entonces, no hay que sentirse desmotivado porque, quizás no tengo tanta información. Al final la información va saliendo en base a conversaciones con tu abogado, y ahí en conjunto van a tener más cosas que aportarle a la policía.
刚才问的问题就是，如果想跟美国调查局合作的话，是不是有什么必须有的关于人贩子的信息吗？答案是其实没有什么就是必须有的信息，跟美国调查局合作也没有什么就是最低的条件必须去符合。有一些人对人贩子特别了解，知道他们的真名字，知道他们的出生日期啊，知道他们的亲戚等等消息。但是我们也有一些客户只知道人贩子的小名，就是别人怎么称呼他。但是这种情况也可以去给那个美国调查局报告关于人贩子的消息。我们也可以帮助受害者看一看他们是不是记得其他的信息，比如说如果可以记住一个地址的话，或者是记住其他人的名字，比如说帮着人贩子的司机，或者是其他的人物。还有有的时候执法部门那儿其实已经知道有这个人贩子，所以如果我们过去给他们说，哦，这是这个人贩子的小名，不知道你是不是感兴趣再了解一下吗？他们可能会已经知道这个人物，然后想就是跟客户再谈一谈。
All right, do we have any more questions?
¿Alguien tiene más preguntas?
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining our presentation again. I put my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me if you would like the recording. I'll let you all translate.
Muchas gracias por venir a esta presentación. Alea les compartió su email por si le quieren pedir la grabación de esta presentación. Además, yo les estoy poniendo aquí en el chat el número de teléfono de la línea de ayuda del Iniciativo contra la Trata y nuestro correo electrónico. Ángela pregunta si puede tener una copia de esta presentación. Sí, escríbele un mail a Lía. Y con esto me despido y I give the floor to Kathy and Nini.
谢谢大家来参加我们这个研讨会。那么如果你们将来还有问题的话，可以给我们发邮件。Barbara 把我们的热线电话号码还有我们的电子邮箱都在 chat 里边写上了。另外，如果你想拿到这个研讨会的视频的话，也可以给 Alia 发邮件。他的电子邮箱也在 chat 里边，就是 ajones@sffny.org。